Cowboy saved girl from wolves, not knowing she would be his bride. The mountains knew how to keep secrets. They rose up from the earth like broken teeth, white with snow, silent under a sky the color of old iron. Caleb had been riding for 3 days without seeing another soul. That was how he preferred it. The world had a way of taking things from a man. Hope, warmth, reasons to stay. Out here, in the high country, where the wind cut through leather and bone, there was nothing left to lose. His horse moved carefully through the drifts, breath steaming in the cold. Caleb kept his head down, his hat pulled low. He was a cowboy without cattle, a drifter without destination. The kind of man who showed up in towns long enough to earn a week's pay and disappeared before anyone thought to ask his name. He carried a rifle across his saddle and a revolver at his hip, but he hadn't fired either in months. Violence had a sound to it, a weight. And Caleb had grown tired of carrying that weight. The howl came from somewhere below the ridgeline. It was long and low, rising and falling like a prayer sung in a language older than words. Then another joined it, and another. Caleb pulled his horse to a stop and listened. Wolves. A pack, maybe 6 or 7, calling to each other in the fading light. He'd heard that sound before in other mountains, other winters. Usually, it meant they'd found something to eat. He should have kept riding, should have turned his horse west and left the mountains behind. But something in the tone of the howls made him pause. There was urgency in them. Hunger, yes, but something else too. Excitement. The kind that came when prey was close, but still fighting. Caleb turned his horse toward the sound. The trail descended through a narrow canyon where the wind funneled up from the valley floor, carrying with it the scent of pine and cold stone. The light was nearly gone now, the sun slipping behind the peaks, leaving only a thin line of gold along the horizon. Shadows pooled in the low places. And there, at the bottom of the slope where the trail widened into a clearing, he saw them. 7 wolves, circling something in the snow. Caleb dismounted slowly, his boots sinking into the drift. He pulled his rifle from its scabbard and worked the lever, the metallic click sharp in the stillness. The wolves heard it, their heads turned, yellow eyes gleaming in the dusk. For a moment, man and beast measured each other across the distance. Then the largest of them, a gray male with a torn ear, curled his lip and growled. Caleb raised the rifle and fired into the air. The shot cracked through the canyon like thunder. The wolves scattered, bounding into the trees with startling speed. But they didn't go far. Caleb could see them in the shadows, watching, waiting. Wolves didn't give up a meal easily. Not in winter. Not when food was scarce and the snow ran deep. He moved forward, rifle ready, and saw what they'd been circling. A stagecoach. Or what was left of one. It lay on its side in the snow, one wheel shattered, the other still spinning slowly in the wind. The horses were gone, either run off or dragged into the woods. Blood darkened the snow in long streaks. Caleb approached carefully, his eyes scanning the wreckage. The door hung open, creaking on broken hinges. Inside, huddled against the far wall, was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 19 or 20. Her dress was torn, her face pale beneath a tangle of dark hair. Blood ran from a cut above her eye, and her hands, small, trembling, clutched a piece of which she must have broken from the seat. A weapon, or the hope of one. When she saw Caleb, she flinched, pressing herself harder against the wall. "Easy," he said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you." Her eyes, wide, frightened, the color of storm clouds, moved from his face to the rifle in his hands. She didn't speak, didn't move, just watched him the way a cornered animal watches, weighing whether to fight or freeze. Caleb lowered the rifle slowly and set it against the side of the coach. He raised his hands, palms out. "You hurt bad." She shook her head, a small movement uncertain. "Can you walk?" A pause. Then another shake of her head. Caleb glanced over his shoulder. The wolves were still out there, shadows among shadows. He could feel their eyes on him, patient and hungry. The sun was gone now. Night was coming fast, and with it the cold that could kill just as surely as teeth and claws. He looked back at the girl. "I'm going to get you out of here." "All right." She didn't answer. But when he stepped closer, she didn't pull away. He knelt in the doorway, snow crunching under his knees, and reached for her. She flinched again, but this time she let him take her arm. Her skin was ice cold. He could feel her shaking, whether from fear or cold or shock, he couldn't tell. Maybe all three. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice low, steady. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. Her lips were cracked, her face drawn with pain. Caleb didn't press. Names didn't matter right now. Survival did. He pulled off his coat, thick wool-lined with fur, the only thing keeping the mountain cold from his bones, and wrapped it around her shoulders. She clutched it immediately, pulling it tight against her chest like it was the only warmth left in the world. Her fingers dug into the fabric, white-knuckled, desperate. "Hold on to me," he said. She nodded. Caleb lifted her carefully, one arm under her knees, the other around her back. She was lighter than he expected, fragile in a way that made something tighten in his chest. He carried her out of the wreckage and into the snow, moving quickly toward his horse. The wolves shifted in the darkness, low growls rumbling through the trees. Caleb kept his eyes on them, his jaw tight. He set the girl on his horse first, then swung up behind her. She leaned back against him, her head resting just below his chin. He could feel her breathing, shallow, uneven. He wrapped one arm around her waist to steady her and took the reins with the other. "Stay with me," he murmured. The wolves followed them up the trail, keeping to the edges of the firelight once Caleb found a sheltered spot beneath an overhang of rock. He built a fire quickly, feeding it until the flames pushed back the night. The girl sat close to the heat, still wrapped in his coat, staring into the fire with eyes that seemed to see something far away, something Caleb couldn't reach. He didn't ask questions, didn't try to fill the silence with words. Out here, silence was honest. It didn't lie or demand things a man couldn't give. But as the night deepened and the wolves howled in the distance, Caleb found himself watching her, wondering who she was, where she'd been going, why she'd been alone. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a thought formed, quiet, unbidden, dangerous. He should have kept riding. The town appeared at dawn, rising from the valley floor like something built from memory and necessity. Caleb saw the church steeple first, white against the pale morning sky, then the row of buildings along the main street, a general store, a saloon with its doors still closed, a livery stable where smoke curled from a chimney. It was the kind of frontier settlement that clung to the edge of the wilderness, small enough that everyone knew everyone, large enough to survive another winter. The girl, Emma, though he still didn't know her name, had slept most of the night pressed against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. When the sun rose and painted the mountains gold, she'd opened her eyes and looked at the town below without speaking. Caleb felt her stiffen in his arms, felt the way her fingers tightened on the fabric of his shirt. "You know this place?" he asked quietly. She nodded once. A small movement, but it carried weight. Caleb guided his horse down the slope, following the trail that cut through stands of pine and aspen. The air smelled of wood smoke and frost. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. By the time they reached the main street, a few people had emerged from their homes, a rancher carrying a bucket toward the well, a woman sweeping her porch, an old man sitting outside the general store with a pipe clenched between his teeth. They all stopped when they saw Caleb. A stranger riding into town always drew attention. A stranger carrying a girl wrapped in a man's coat, her face bruised and pale, drew more than that. Caleb felt their eyes on him, assessing, cautious. He kept his expression neutral, his posture relaxed. He'd learned long ago that the way a cowboy carried himself told people more than words ever could. He stopped in front of the church, a simple wooden building with a cross above the door and windows that caught the early light. Before he could dismount, the door opened and a man stepped out. He was in his 50s, maybe, with gray streaking his dark hair and kind eyes that had seen enough suffering to recognize it in others. A preacher, Caleb guessed. The kind who buried the dead and married the living and tried to hold a town together when everything else fell apart. The preacher's gaze moved from Caleb to the girl, and his face changed. Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, then shock, then a grief so deep it made him reach for the doorframe to steady himself. Emma. His voice cracked on the name. The girl lifted her head slowly. When she saw the preacher, her eyes filled with tears. She tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat, tangled up with everything she'd survived in the mountains. The preacher came down the steps quickly, his boots thudding on the wood. "Emma Harper," he said again, and this time it wasn't a question. "Dear God, child, we thought you were dead." Caleb dismounted and reached up to help her down. She gripped his shoulders as he lowered her to the ground, and when her feet touched the earth, her knees buckled. Caleb caught her, holding her upright while the preacher hurried forward. "What happened?" the preacher asked, looking between them. "Where did you find her?" "In the mountains," Caleb said. "Stagecoach was wrecked. Wolves had it surrounded." The preacher's face went pale. "The others?" Caleb shook his head. The preacher closed his eyes, his lips moving in what might have been a prayer. Then he opened them again and looked at Caleb with something that might have been gratitude or might have been guilt. "You saved her life." "Just did what needed doing," Caleb said. By now, others had gathered. The rancher set down his bucket. The woman left her broom on the porch. The old man with the pipe stood and walked closer, squinting at Emma as if trying to place her in his memory. A younger woman, a widow, judging by her black dress, hurried over with a blanket and wrapped it around Emma's shoulders. "Emma Harper," the widow breathed. "John Harper's daughter." The name rippled through the small crowd like a stone dropped in still water. John Harper. Caleb didn't know who that was, but he could see that it mattered. Could see it in the way people looked at Emma, in the softness that came into their faces, in the way they moved closer, as if to shield her from whatever darkness had found her in those mountains. The preacher took Emma's arm gently. "Come inside, child. You're safe now. We'll get you warm, get the doctor to look at those cuts." Emma nodded, but she didn't move. Her hand, small, trembling, reached out and found Caleb's. Her fingers closed around his, holding on with surprising strength. The preacher noticed. Everyone noticed. "This is the man who brought you home," the preacher asked her softly. Emma looked up at Caleb. Her eyes were still full of tears, but there was something else in them now. Something that made Caleb's chest tighten in a way he didn't understand and didn't want. "He saved me," she whispered. The first words she'd spoken since he'd found her. Her voice was rough, broken, but it carried across the morning air like a bell. The townspeople looked at Caleb differently then, not with suspicion or caution, but with something warmer, something he wasn't used to and didn't know how to hold. The preacher extended his hand. "I'm Reverend Thomas. This town owes you a debt, stranger." Caleb shook his hand briefly. "No debt. I was just passing through." "Well," the Reverend said, glancing at Emma, who was still holding Caleb's hand, "you're welcome to stay as long as you need. We don't have much, but we take care of those who take care of us." Caleb felt a familiar urge rise in him, the need to move, to leave, to disappear before anyone started asking questions or expecting things he couldn't give. He'd already stayed too long. Towns had a way of trapping a man, of making him think he could belong somewhere when the truth was he never could. He gently tried to pull his hand free from Emma's grip. "I should be moving on." Her fingers tightened. "Please." That one word stopped him, not because it was loud or desperate, but because it was quiet, because it carried the weight of every mile she traveled, every moment she'd spent alone in that broken stagecoach with wolves circling and death closing in. Because it wasn't a demand or an expectation. It was a hope so fragile it might break if he said no. "Stay," she said, looking up at him with those storm cloud eyes. "Just one more day." Caleb looked at her, at this girl whose name he'd only just learned, whose life had somehow become tangled with his in the space of a single night. He thought about the mountains behind them, cold and empty and waiting. He thought about the road ahead, stretching west toward nothing in particular. He thought about all the towns he'd left behind, all the people he'd walked away from without looking back. He should say no. should climb back on his horse and ride until this place was just another memory, another story he'd never tell. But instead he heard himself say, one day. The relief that flooded Emma's face was almost too much to look at. She nodded, releasing his hand slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid he might vanish if she let go too quickly. The preacher smiled, a sad, knowing smile, and guided her toward the church. The widow followed, and the rancher and several others, all of them surrounding her like a wall of warmth against the cold. Caleb stood in the street, watching them go. The old man, with the pipe, walked over and clapped him on the shoulder. John Harper dug the well that saved this town 10 years back, he said quietly. During the drought. Lost his own land doing it, but he saved ours. We buried him last spring. He paused, looking toward the church where Emma had disappeared inside. She's all that's left of him now. All that's left of the man who gave us water when we were dying of thirst. The old man walked away, leaving Caleb alone in the street with his horse and the morning light and the weight of something he didn't want to carry. One day, he'd promised. But as the sun climbed higher and the town woke around him, Caleb wondered if one day would be enough to leave, or if this girl with the storm cloud eyes had already begun to anchor him to a place he never meant to stay. One day became two. Two became a week. A week became something Caleb stopped counting. He told himself he was just helping out. The winter had been hard on the town, and there was work that needed doing. Fences to mend where the snow had crushed them, roofs to patch where the weight of ice had pulled shingles loose, firewood to split for the families who couldn't do it themselves. The rancher whose land bordered the church had lost half his herd to the cold, and he needed extra hands to repair the barn before the spring rains came. Caleb was a drifter, yes, but he was also a cowboy. He knew how to work with his hands, how to fix what was broken, how to be useful without being noticed. But people noticed anyway. They noticed the way he showed up at dawn and worked until dusk, his shirt soaked with sweat even in the cold. They noticed how he never asked for payment, just took whatever food the widow brought him at midday and ate it standing up, always watching the tree line as if expecting something to emerge from a forest. They noticed that he slept in the livery stable instead of accepting the preacher's offer of a room, curling up in the hay beside his horse like he didn't trust walls to hold him. And they noticed Emma. She recovered slowly. The doctor, a tired man with gentle hands and eyes that had seen too many people die, tended to her cuts and bruises, wrapped her ribs where they'd been cracked, and told her to rest. But Emma didn't rest. She sat on the porch of the preacher's house, wrapped in quilts that the town women brought, and watched Caleb work. She didn't speak much. Didn't need to. Her presence was enough, steady, quiet, like a candle burning in a window. Caleb felt her watching. Every time he drove a nail or lifted a beam, he knew her eyes were on him. It made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't explain. He was used to being invisible, to moving through the world without leaving a trace. But Emma saw him, really saw him, and that scared him more than wolves ever could. The townspeople began to whisper. At first, it was just the old women, their voices soft as they gathered water from the well or hung laundry in the morning light. But soon it spread to the rancher and his sons, to the men who drank coffee outside the general store, to the families who came to Sunday service and saw Emma sitting in the front pew with Caleb standing awkwardly at the back, hat in hand, looking like a man who'd wandered into the wrong building. They whispered about how he'd saved her, how he'd carried her down from the mountains like something precious, how she looked at him with eyes full of gratitude and something deeper, something the town recognized even if Caleb didn't. They whispered about her father, John Harper, and how he'd been a good man who'd given everything to help others. They whispered about Emma being alone now, with no family left, no one to protect her or provide for her. And they whispered about what a drifter's intentions might be. Caleb heard the whispers. He wasn't deaf, and frontier towns were small enough that secrets traveled faster than horses. He tried to ignore them, tried to focus on the work, on the rhythm of hammer and saw, and the simple honesty of labor. But the whispers followed him like shadows, and he could feel the weight of them settling on his shoulders, heavy, unavoidable, like a debt he never agreed to pay. It was Reverend Thomas who finally said it out loud. The preacher found him behind the church one evening, splitting wood as the sun dropped behind the mountains. Caleb saw him coming and kept working, the axe rising and falling in steady strokes. The Reverend stood there for a moment, hands clasped behind his back, watching the way would split clean under the blade. "You're good at this," the preacher said. "It's just work," Caleb replied. "You've been doing a lot of it." For a man who was only staying one day. Caleb didn't answer. He set another log on the chopping block and brought the axe down hard. The wood cracked apart, falling into two neat halves. The preacher was quiet for a while, the kind of quiet that meant he was choosing his words carefully. "The town's grateful for what you did. What you've been doing. Don't need gratitude." "No," the preacher agreed. "I don't suppose you do. But they're going to give it anyway. That's how people are in places like this. We take care of each other. We remember kindness." Caleb lifted the axe again, but he didn't swing. He just held it there, the weight of it familiar in his hands. "What is it you're trying to say, Reverend?" "I'm saying people are talking. And when people talk in a small town, it means they're trying to figure something out." The preacher paused. "They're trying to figure out your intentions." Caleb lowered the axe slowly. "My intentions. With Emma." There it was. The thing everyone had been dancing around. The question hanging in the air like smoke. Caleb set the axe down and turned to face the preacher fully. "I don't have any intentions. I found her in the mountains. I brought her here. That's all." "Is it?" "Yes." The preacher studied him with those kind, knowing eyes. "Emma's father was the best man I ever knew. When the drought came, he dug that well with his own hands. Worked himself half to death doing it. Lost his ranch, lost everything he built. But he gave this town water. He gave us life." The preacher's voice softened. "Emma's all that's left of him. She's alone in this world, Caleb. And the people here, they want to see her taken care of." Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. "I'm not the man for that." "Why not?" "Because I'm not." He said it harder than he meant to, the words sharp as broken glass. "I'm a drifter. I've got nothing to offer anybody. No land, no money, no future. I move from place to place because that's what I do. That's all I know how to do." "Or maybe," the preacher said quietly, "it's all you've let yourself do." The words hit Caleb like a fist. He turned away, staring at the mountains where the last light clung to the peaks like something afraid to let go. He wanted to tell the preacher he was wrong. Wanted to explain that some men were built for staying and some were built for leaving, and Caleb had always been the latter. But the words wouldn't come. Because somewhere deep down, in a place he didn't want to look, he wondered if the preacher might be right. "Think about it," the preacher said, and walked back toward the church, his footsteps quiet on the frozen ground. Caleb stood alone in the gathering dark, the axe at his feet, the smell of split wood sharp in the air. He thought about leaving, about saddling his horse in the middle of the night and riding out before anyone could stop him, before the town's expectations became too heavy to carry. He'd done it before. He could do it again. But when he looked toward the preacher's house, he saw Emma sitting on the porch, wrapped in her quilts, watching him. Even from this distance, even in the dim light, he could feel the weight of her gaze. It wasn't demanding, wasn't pleading. It was just there, steady, patient, like she was willing to wait forever if that's what it took. That night, after everyone had gone to bed and the town had settled into silence, Caleb sat in the livery stable with his back against a post, cleaning his revolver by lamplight. It was something he did when he couldn't sleep, when his mind was too full of thoughts he didn't want to think. The gun was old, worn smooth by years of use, and the ritual of taking it apart and putting it back together had a kind of peace to it. He heard footsteps outside, light, careful, and looked up to see Emma standing in the doorway. She wore a shawl over her nightdress, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked younger like this, more vulnerable, but there was a strength in her eyes that hadn't been there in the mountains. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't mean to disturb you." "You're not," Caleb said, though his heart had started beating faster. You should be sleeping. So should you. She stepped inside, moving carefully, and sat down on a bale of hay a few feet away. For a while, neither of them spoke. The lamplight flickered between them, casting long shadows on the stable walls. Caleb's horse shifted in his stall, and somewhere outside, an owl called into the night. Emma reached into the pocket of her shawl and pulled something out. She held it in both hands for a moment, as if it were precious or fragile, then extended it toward him. "I made this for you," she said. Caleb set down the gun and took what she offered. It was a small wooden carving, rough but careful, shaped with someone's hands and time and attention. A wolf, not snarling or fierce, but sitting quietly, its head tilted slightly as if listening to something only it could hear. The details were simple: the curve of its back, the points of its ears, the way its tail wrapped around its paws, but they were done with care. "You made this?" he asked. Emma nodded. "My father taught me. He used to carve things when he couldn't sleep. Said it helped him think." She looked down at her hands. "I wanted to give you something. To thank you." "You don't need to thank me." "I know," she said. "But I wanted to anyway." Caleb turned the carving over in his hands, feeling the smooth wood, the weight of it. It was such a small thing, but it carried something bigger. Hours of work, thought, intention. He looked at Emma, at the way the lamplight caught in her eyes, at the quiet strength in her face. "You saved me," she said softly. "From the wolves. From dying in those mountains. But I think—" She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I think maybe I saved you too." Caleb felt something break open inside him. Something he'd kept locked away for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he didn't need saving, that he was fine the way he was. But the words wouldn't come. Because maybe, just maybe, she was right. He closed his fingers around the wooden wolf and looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time since he'd found her in that wrecked stagecoach, he didn't want to leave. Spring came slowly to Montana, like something afraid to believe winter was truly over. The snow melted first in the valleys, then crept up the mountainsides, leaving behind brown grass and mud and the promise of green things. The river that ran past the town swelled with snowmelt, its voice loud and urgent after months of silence. Birds returned, swallows building nests under the eaves of the church, hawks circling high above the ranches, their shadows racing across the awakening land. The air smelled different too, not just of pine and cold stone anymore, but of earth and rain and life finding its way back. Caleb had been in the town for 2 months. He'd stopped counting the days somewhere around the 3rd week, when counting became a weight instead of a comfort. He'd fixed every fence that needed fixing, patched every roof that leaked, chopped enough firewood to last the entire town through next winter. He'd become a fixture, the quiet cowboy who worked hard and spoke little, who slept in the stable and took his meals standing up, who watched the mountains with eyes that always seemed to be measuring distance. But something had changed. Something small and undeniable, like the first blade of grass pushing through frozen ground. He'd stopped thinking about leaving. It hadn't been a decision, exactly. More like a realization that crept up on him when he wasn't paying attention. One morning he woke up and saddled his horse out of habit, and then stood there with the reins in his hand, staring at the open road, and felt nothing. No pull, no restlessness, just the quiet knowledge that everything he needed was behind him, not ahead. Emma was getting stronger. The cuts had healed, leaving thin white scars that she touched sometimes when she thought no one was watching. Her ribs no longer hurt when she breathed. She'd started helping the widow with washing and mending, her hands quick and sure with needle and thread. She smiled more now, not the big, easy smiles of someone who'd never known pain, but the small, careful smiles of someone learning how to trust the world again. And she still watched Caleb. Every day, every moment she could. The townspeople had stopped whispering and started waiting. They could see what was building between the drifter and the girl, even if neither of them had named it yet. It wasn't love, not the kind sung about in ballads or written in storybooks. It was something quieter, more honest, something built on shared silence, and the kind of trust that only comes when two people have looked at death together and walked away holding each other up. The rancher's wife told the widow, who told the women at the church, who told their husbands, who nodded knowingly over their coffee. Even the children seemed to understand, watching Caleb and Emma with the strange wisdom children sometimes have about things adults try too hard to explain. It was Reverend Thomas who finally spoke to Caleb about it, not with questions this time, but with an offer. "The old Harper place," the preacher said one afternoon, finding Caleb repairing the gate to the churchyard. "It's been empty since John died, just sitting there, waiting for someone to give it purpose again." Caleb looked up from his work, hammer in hand. "What about it? It's Emma's by right, her inheritance. But she can't work it alone. Can't live out there by herself." The preacher paused, choosing his words with care. "She'll need a husband, someone to help her build a life on that land her father gave everything for." The word hung in the air between them. Husband. Caleb set down the hammer, slowly. "You asking me to marry her?" "I'm not asking anything," the preacher said. "I'm just telling you what needs saying. What the whole town can see, even if you can't." He looked at Caleb with those kind, steady eyes. "You're already half married to her in every way that matters. You just haven't made it honest yet." Caleb didn't answer. He picked up the hammer and drove another nail, the sound sharp and final in the spring air. But the preacher's words stayed with him, settling into his bones like cold or hunger or any other thing a man learns to carry. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the mountains and painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, Caleb found Emma in the churchyard. She was tending the small garden the widow had started, pulling weeds from between the new shoots of vegetables. Her hands were dirty, her sleeves rolled up, and there was a smudge of earth on her cheek. She looked real in a way that made Caleb's chest tighten. "Emma," he said. She looked up, brushing hair from her face. "Yes." He stood there for a moment, this cowboy who'd spent his whole life moving, and tried to find words for something he'd never had to say before. "I need to ask you something." She set down her trowel and stood, wiping her hands on her apron. The last light caught in her eyes, those storm cloud eyes that had watched him from the first moment he'd carried her out of those mountains. "All right. I'm not." He stopped, started again. "I'm not good with words. Never have been. And I don't know how to say this the way men are supposed to." Emma waited, patient, still. Caleb took a breath. "I'm broken," he said quietly. "I've done things I'm not proud of. I've left people behind, walked away from places that might have been home if I'd let them. I don't have much to offer. No money, no fancy words, no promises about what kind of man I'll be tomorrow." He looked at her fully, letting her see all the rough edges he usually kept hidden. "But I'm here, and if you'll have me, I'll stay. I'll work your father's land. I'll help you build whatever life you want to build. I'll be honest with you, even when the truth is hard." The silence stretched between them, heavy with weight and meaning. Then Emma smiled, not a big smile, but a real one, the kind that reached her eyes and made them bright. "I know you're broken," she said softly. "I know because I am too." She stepped closer, closing the distance between them until they stood face to face in the fading light. She reached up and touched his cheek, a gentle gesture, full of something that might have been love or might have been something better, something more lasting. "I don't need grand words," she said. "I don't need promises about forever. I just need to know you're choosing this, choosing me, choosing to stay even though everything in you probably wants to run." "I'm choosing," Caleb said. "If you'll have me." "I will," Emma said. And those two small words carried the weight of a vow made before any preacher could speak them. The wedding happened 3 days later. It was small, the way frontier weddings often were, just the town gathered in the church, the women in their Sunday dresses, the men in their cleanest shirts. The widow brought wild flowers from the meadow, and the rancher's wife baked bread. Children sat in the front pews, swinging their legs and whispering until their mothers shushed them quiet. Emma wore a dress that had belonged to her mother, simple, white, mended carefully where time had worn it thin. She carried no bouquet, just her father's old Bible, the leather cover soft with age and use. Her hair was pulled back, and she wore no jewelry except a small silver locket that held a photograph of her parents, both long gone. Caleb stood at the altar in the same clothes he'd worn the day he'd ridden into town, clean now, but still marked by years of use and travel. He'd left his gun at the stable, but he'd kept the wooden wolf Emma had carved for him, tucked in his pocket where he could feel its weight against his heart. Reverend Thomas stood before them, his Bible open, his voice steady as he spoke the words that would bind them together. But Caleb barely heard them. He was too aware of Emma standing beside him, her hand small and warm in his, her presence solid and real in a way that made the rest of the world feel distant. When the preacher asked if he took Emma as his wife, Caleb said, "I do." 2 simple words, but they carried everything he couldn't say with poetry or grace. His promise to try, his willingness to stay, his choice to build something instead of always tearing himself away. When Emma said, "I do," her voice was clear and sure, no tremor of doubt or hesitation. She squeezed his hand once, twice, a silent language they developed over weeks of working side by side in comfortable quiet. The preacher pronounced them married, and the town erupted in quiet celebration. Handshakes and hugs, and the kind of joy that comes from seeing something broken made whole again. The widow cried. The rancher clapped Caleb on the back hard enough to make him stumble. The children threw handfuls of dried flowers that the women had saved from last summer. But Caleb barely noticed any of it. He was looking at Emma, his wife now, though the word felt strange and new in his mind, and seeing in her eyes the same thing he felt in his chest. Not love, not yet, but trust. And maybe that was better. Maybe that was the foundation love needed to grow from, not passion or romance, but the simple, honest choice to stand together when the world gave you every reason to stand apart. That night, after the celebration ended and the town settled into sleep, Caleb and Emma walked out to the Harper place, their place now. It sat at the edge of town, a small cabin with a porch that faced the mountains. The well John Harper had dug stood in the yard, still and silent, a monument to the kind of sacrifice that made life possible in hard places. They stood together on that porch, looking at the mountains where wolves still ran and winters still came hard and life was never promised. The moon rose full and bright, turning the snow on the peaks to silver. And from somewhere in the darkness, far off but clear, came the sound of howling, long and low and wild, like a song sung by creatures who knew nothing of marriage or towns or the choices people made to survive. Emma leaned against Caleb's shoulder, and he put his arm around her, tentative at first, then sure. They didn't speak, didn't need to. The silence between them was full of understanding, of shared history, of a future they'd build together one day at a time. They were strangers still, in many ways, but they were strangers who'd chosen each other, who'd looked at their own brokenness and decided it was enough to build something beautiful on. And as the wolves sang to the moon and the spring wind carried the smell of new grass and possibility, Caleb felt something he hadn't felt in years, something that might have been peace, or might have been hope, or might have been the quiet beginning of home.